Hi, Vox. Welcome back. So we started 2025 with Satya Nadella proclaiming that SaaS is dead, that AI is going to eat SaaS. And to be honest, at the time, I thought that was a little bit hypey because I couldn't quite see the exact mechanism via which it happens. But we are ending 2025 with what I think is the perfect example of how exactly that happens. You might have heard of this. An engineer at Cursor went and vibe code rewrote their CMS, and you could not construct a more perfect example of the new dynamics of how software and SaaS and agents all collide and how it all shakes out. So I want to talk about this in a bit more detail. All right, so let's get into the background. What happened was that Lee Robinson, who works at Cursor, was unhappy with their CMS. Now, it's important to understand why they were unhappy with their CMS. The key reason is that the CMS that they had just migrated to was not agent friendly anymore. What does that mean? As he says over here, previously we could add Cursor and ask it to modify the code and content. But with this new CMS abstraction, they had to go back to using a GUI. You couldn't just add the CMS as an agent or through an agent. And this, I think, is the core lever via which AI and agents are attacking SaaS. This notion of agent friendliness, which means that an agent should be able to invoke it and operate it. And armed with this discontent, Lee Robinson went and actually did this migration away from their headless CMS into a custom vibe coded solution in 3 days with about $260 in tokens. I'd really encourage you to read this entire blog post because this is also an excellent study in how one would use AI assisted programming and agentic coding to do such a large real world migration. And one of the key ideas here is that this migration was actually removing complexity. And Robinson acknowledges the trade offs here. There are times when you need a full blown CMS, and there are certain teams and certain setups where it really helps. But Cursor is not exactly the kind of team where the cost of a full blown CMS abstraction would be worth it. And he goes into how he deconstructed that abstraction and used other basic building blocks. Like, for example, you need to manage users, but this is for a largely engineering team. So their user management is basically just GitHub. So you have SSO via GitHub, so you don't need a separate user management abstraction. And he goes down this list. Now, to their credit, Sanity, which is the CMS that Cursor was using before this vibe code rewrite, went and published a very long and detailed rebuttal to this approach. And I give them a lot of credit because this is a very well thought out reply. So I want to go through the flip side of this argument as well. Now, I'll tip my hand a little bit because I know this sounds harsh, but this rebuttal kind of sounds like a plea from the horse carriage makers at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, and I'll explain why. The CMS guys acknowledge that CMSs have gotten way too complex, and that in this particular case, some 300K lines of a CMS were removed in exchange for about 40,000 lines of new code. This is Cursor's new CMS. And they acknowledged the core discontent which drove all this. AI agents couldn't easily reach content behind authenticated APIs of a CMS. So they get the main dynamic that is at play here. And their answer is that they now have an MCP server. So if you're using Sanity as a CMS, you can connect to their MCP server, and that's how you can still use an agent to perform CMS kinds of actions. And then the rest of this post is arguing for how you eventually will end up needing a full-blown CMS. So as he says over here, Lee actually ended up building a small CMS. And he goes through a bunch of reasons why you will end up bringing back the same level of complexity, because all these mechanisms that seem simple now will end up accreting feature requests and complexity over time, and you will very likely end up with the same large complex CMS that Sanity is currently. And I think what he's doing over here is appealing to this classic software engineering argument, which was very well articulated by Joel Spolsky back in 2000, 25 years ago, where he details the reasons why you should never, ever do a rewrite. You should never try to rewrite a code base in the hopes of making it better. And if you're a software engineering manager, you'll be able to relate to this, because almost always some of your brightest engineers will come to you and tell you that the current code base is unsalvageable and that we must rewrite it. And Spolsky goes over a detailed argument for why that is almost always a mistake. And I agree with him. On large, complex software projects, a rewrite is almost always a mistake. But the crucial point here is that this was written in an age when creating software was expensive. And Lee Robinson is living in an age when creating software is not expensive, not at all, like he says. He did it in 3 days with about $200 in tokens. The argument that the Sanity folks are making is that you haven't really eliminated the complexity, you've just moved it to other places. And the thing is, in traditional software, before LLMs and AI, that would have been completely true, because the main value proposition of a CMS like Sanity is that they take all these different pieces that one needs to construct a product, like a CMS in this case, and they vertically integrate it. So you don't have to worry about individually cobbling together all these pieces. However, if you look at the argument that Robinson is making on the cursor side, he's saying that we already have pieces that do all these things. For example, we're using GitHub for user management. We're using Next.js draft mode for previewing changes, and so on. So he goes down the list, and in their end setup, they already have individual building blocks and abstractions that handle all these things. And then they just did a light integration pass on top of all this to integrate all these things. Now, traditionally, that was really expensive, but now it is cheap. But what they got in return was control and flexibility over this entire stack. So they were not dependent on the product direction and sensibility of Sanity in terms of how one would integrate all this to make a product. They made a bespoke product that exactly fits their team, their requirements, and their workflows. And the main point is that it is easier and quicker to do this now. Essentially, you don't need someone else's opinionated product for a given task. You can build your very own opinionated product if you have the basic building blocks. And I think that is the other key dynamic at play over here. Number one was that software needs to be agent friendly. In other words, don't make me click around on a GUI. Make it so that it is invocable and operatable via an AI agent. And number two is that if you have all these building blocks already in your tech stack, and almost every company does, then you yourself can construct a very bespoke, opinionated solution on top of it. So I thought this was a really, really illustrative case of how agents are eating SaaS and eating biz logic in general. And this dynamic will just keep playing out in product after product, vertical after vertical. So keep an eye on this. All right. I hope you enjoyed that. If you like content like this, please like the video, consider subscribing, and I will see you next time.